We'll now address the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, a sensory pathway. This pathway is responsible for conscious proprioception, two-point discrimination, and vibratory sense. The peripheral receptors for these modalities are muscle spindles for proprioception and the stretch of muscles, and shown here. The cutaneous Meissner cell for touch, Pacinian corpuscles for deep pressure and vibration, and Golgi tendon organs at the end of muscles for tension within the tendon. The pathway is a 3-neuron ascending chain. The peripheral fibers of the primary neurons have their cell body in the dorsal root ganglion and send large myelinated fibers into the spinal cord through the dorsal root. These primary fibers ascend on the same side to the spinal medullary junction, where they synapse ipsilaterally with second-order neurons. The axons of the second-order neurons decussate, that is, they cross the midline at the spino-medullary junction. Those axons form the medial lemniscus, and they ascend through the brainstem on the opposite side that they started out throughout the brainstem. The secondary neurons, starting out at the spinomedullary junction, will synapse with third-order neurons in the thalamus, in particular in the ventral posterior lateral portion, or VPL portion of the thalamus. These third-order neurons, thalamocortical neurons, will project through the internal capsule to the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex. The dorsal columns are seen here in a cutaway of the spinal cord, a cross-section of the spinal cord. The ascending fibers of the primary neurons, the cell bodies, are in the dorsal root ganglion. The peripheral nerves come in at cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, but they continue their axons into the dorsal portion of the spinal cord and occupy a position for the legs in fasciculus gracilis, for the legs and portions of the spinal cord below T6. And for the arms, coming in higher up, they will come in and occupy a position in fasciculus cuneatus. These primary fibers are sending their axons to second-order neurons that are located in the spinomedullary junction, known as nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, respectively. The dorsal column pathway is shown here in its length, and we can see that lumbar fibers, sensory fibers, coming in with their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion for the legs will come in, and they'll send fibers in the fasciculus gracilis. They'll also send branches of each of those fibers into the ventral gray in order to be involved in synapse and reflexes and other activities in the spinal cord. Higher up, we'll see fibers coming in from T4 and higher that will occupy fasciculus cuneatus and travel up to the spinomedullary junction, where they will synapse at nucleus, the gracilis nucleus for the legs, cuneate nucleus for the arms, and then cross the midline and travel up through the medial lemniscus, in the medial lemniscus through the brainstem, starting out very medially, and then gradually the leg fibers will kick out laterally and eventually the arm will follow it out laterally as it moves up towards the midbrain and end up in the thalamus at the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, and this third order neuron will travel up to the cortex. We see here that in the spinal cord, the posterior spinal artery, there's one on each side, only one is shown here, provides circulation for the dorsal columns. So that damage or an infarct of the posterior spinal artery would only affect dorsal columns on one side and does not affect the other pathways. As we move into the brainstem, we see here the pyramid, and just above the pyramid we see the medial lemniscus with the leg and foot most inferiorly, and the head, the hand and arm most superiorly or dorsally. And we see that the anterior spinal artery feeds both the pyramid and the medial lemniscus. We see here a schematic of the overall pathway for the dorsal column lemniscal pathway, in this case coming in both from the leg and fasciculus gracilis, and from the arm. Here we see the peripheral nerve coming in, dorsal root ganglion coming into the fasciculus cuneatus. They synapse respectively on dorsal column nuclei at the cervical medullary, spinal medullary junction in the caudal medulla. Those secondary neurons cross the midline, decussate at the midline at the caudal medulla, and then occupy the medial lemniscus and travel very close to the midline. And as they move into the pons, they start to move more laterally, particularly with the leg kicking out. As they move to the midbrain, they move further laterally until they synapse in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Then this third order neuron travels through the internal capsule up to the postcentral gyrus, areas 3, 1, and 2. Brodmann area 3, 1, and 2. We'll look at those projections at each level and recognize that at the spinal cord level, we have the fibers coming in the dorsal root and occupying the position, in this case for the arm, in fasciculus cuneatus, and for the leg, fasciculus gracilis. You see the leg has been coming up from below T6. And similar representation on the opposite side. And then it will travel up towards the brainstem. At the brainstem level, we can see that we've arrived at the spinal medullary junction, or the caudal medulla, at which point the fibers coming up in the dorsal columns will synapse at nucleus cuneatus for the arm, nucleus gracilis for the leg. The second order neuron will cross the midline through internal arcuate fibers. This is the decussation of the axons of the dorsal column nuclei to occupy this medial position that's known as the medial lemniscus. And we can see that the medial lemniscus has the leg area most inferiorly or ventrally, just above the pyramid, and recognize that the pyramids have also decussated at just this level. And we see that the leg is most inferior and the arm is most superior at this location. That position is maintained as you move up through the medulla to the rostral medulla, and we see that it's immediately above the pyramid is the medial lemniscus. As we move up to the pons, excuse me, we see that the medial lemniscus has moved away from the corticospinal tract, and now the leg has started to kick out. It's moving laterally. fibers representing the leg. And then you can see at this level of the pons, the superior cerebellar peduncle, as well as the fourth ventricle. And this basis pontus, we see the corticospinal tract fibers represented right here and here. As we move higher, excuse me, into the midbrain, here we see the fibers have moved even more laterally, and now the leg is up here, the arm is here, and this is the medial lemniscus. It's immediately adjacent to the spinal thalamic tract, which is up here. We see the fibers for the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle, and we can see the crus cerebri represented here. As we move up onto the rostral medulla, we see now that the medial lemniscus has moved far laterally, and we also see that we have periaqueductal gray, the cerebral aqueduct, and we see the red nucleus on each side, and we see the crus cerebri and substantia nigra. As we move up to the thalamus, we see the cells have synapsed at the thalamus at VPL, and this third order neuron sends its fibers up to the cortex. Recognize they're going up to the postcentral cortex, which is here in the back, with the leg medial and the arm more lateral. You also can see fibers that have come up representing the head. They're actually fibers that have come from the brainstem nuclei, and we see here a location in the ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus, and those cells will send their fibers out to the more lateral portion of the post-central gyrus representing the head. Damage to the dorsal column lemniscal pathway produces a loss of vibration, two-point discrimination, and position, that is of conscious proprioception, where your limbs are in space. Spinal cord lesions produce ipsilateral effects to the location of the lesion, and that is at all segments at or below the affected level. The sensory loss below that level and extending all the way down is referred to as a sensory level. So damage at C4 would result in a dorsal column at C4 would result in a loss of these sensations on the same side at C4 and at all levels below that. We here see schematically the effect of damage at different locations. So lesions to the dorsal column lemniscal pathway, if they occur in the cerebral cortex or in the thalamus or in the brainstem at any level above the decussation, then they produce a loss of these functions: conscious proprioception, fine touch, vibration, pressure, and two-point discrimination, contralateral and below the insult. So everything on the right side, damage to the right side of cortex, thalamus, internal capsule, or brainstem results in loss of these sensations on the opposite side of the body. And as we'll see, damage in the spinal cord results in ipsilateral damage below the level of the insult. And as you can see, because those dorsal columns are close together in the cervical cord, it's very common that insults at that level will affect both the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, and affect sensation in both the arms and the legs. A lobe down, a lesion in the mid-thoracic level might spare the arms because the fibers have entered above the level of the lesion, but there'd be a sensory level below that level of the thoracic, on the thoracic wall and down into the legs. So, for instance, an insult at T10, damage to the spinal cord at T10 on one side, might produce spinal cord injury with sensory loss beginning near the umbilicus and extending down to the legs, including the legs. Small lesions that are sometimes seen in demyelinating disease, such as MS, might affect just a selected portion of fasciculus gracilis or cuneatus, so just an arm or just a leg, or even a portion of one of those limbs might be affected, depending on the neurons that have been demyelinated. And as we indicated, lesions above the spinal medullary junction all would produce contralateral effects, that is, a loss of all of these sensations on the contralateral side of the body, because at any level above the decussations, the information is coming from the opposite side of the body. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call.